What if I told you the soundtrack to your grandparents' lives wasn't just background noise? It was a powerful force shaping everything from their morning coffee to their wildest dreams. Join us as we journey back to the 1950s, a time when jukeboxes glowed in diners, radios hummed in kitchens, and records spun in dimly lit living rooms. But behind those melodies, beneath the polished smiles of a nation fresh from war, America was a land divided, where the dream of freedom was loud. Yet for millions of black families, silence often spoke louder than song. The 1950s are often remembered in faded postcards, chrome cars gleaming under neon lights, suburban homes lined with white picket fences, and families gathered around the television. It was the age of Elvis, of poodle skirts and drive-in theaters. To many, it looked like America had found its rhythm. But if you listened more closely beyond the crooning love songs on the radio and the laughter pouring out of sitcoms, another beat was pulsing, one raw and unshakable. It was the sound of a people demanding to be heard. For Black America, life in the 1950s was a paradox. On one hand, the country was experiencing unprecedented prosperity. Soldiers returned from World War II, industries boomed, and suburban development stretched as far as the eye could see. Yet this American dream was fenced off. A black soldier who had fought for democracy abroad often returned home to a Jim Crow reality, where whites-only signs barred him from lunch counters, buses, and even voting booths. Prosperity had a color, and too often it wasn't black. Imagine waking up in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. You put on your work clothes, knowing you'll walk past city buses that carry a cruel rule: you must sit in the back. No matter how tired your feet, no matter how empty the seats up front. For some, like Rosa Parks, that daily insult would one day ignite a revolution. But for countless others, it was a routine humiliation endured with quiet dignity, a weight carried as heavily as the morning sun. Yet music was always there. For many black families, the crackle of a record player or the sweet harmony of a church choir was more than sound, it was survival. Gospel voices rose on Sunday mornings like wings, lifting people above the grind of segregation. Meanwhile, in smoky clubs and makeshift stages, rhythm and blues pulsed with defiance. These were songs of love, pain, joy, and protest songs that would give birth to rock and roll, a sound America couldn't ignore even if it tried. Take Sam Cooke, who began in gospel but soon carried his velvet voice into popular music. Or Ray Charles, fusing blues, jazz, and gospel into something unapologetically bold. Their music wasn't just entertainment, it was a challenge to boundaries. Every note bent against the bars of a cage America had built around black life. Even Elvis Presley, crowned the king of rock and roll, drew deeply from the well of black rhythm and blues, a truth both celebrated and resented. The irony was stark. Black artists created the heartbeat of the era, yet were often shut out from its stage. In the North, opportunities seemed brighter but were far from equal. Harlem nightclubs buzzed with jazz brilliance, Chicago's South Side thrummed with blues, and Detroit would soon hum with the birth of Motown. But redlining, the practice of denying black families access to housing in certain neighborhoods, kept the so-called dream of suburbia out of reach. Banks refused loans, schools remained segregated in practice if not in law, and the promise of better in the North often came with the sting of a new kind of discrimination less visible than Southern Jim Crow, but just as sharp. Still, dignity was never surrendered. Across dinner tables, black parents passed on stories of resilience. They told their children, education is your weapon, faith is your anchor, and music is your refuge. And so, in kitchens filled with the scent of cornbread and collard greens, radios carried Nat King Cole's smooth voice. While neighborhoods erupted with laughter at backyard barbecues, where the blues played loud enough to make the whole block sway. But it wasn't just joy. Fear lived in the 1950s too. To be black in the South meant knowing that a wrong word, a misplaced glance, or simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time could be deadly. In 1955, the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy accused of whistling at a white woman, shocked the nation. His open casket funeral forced America to look at what many had tried to keep hidden. The sound of his mother's grief was louder than any radio, her voice a mournful anthem of truth. That tragedy became one of the first sparks of a movement that would not be silenced. And here lies the hidden power of the 1950s soundtrack. It wasn't just about melody, it was about memory. Each song was tied to the struggle, the longing, and the everyday endurance of Black life. A love ballad could carry double meaning, a yearning not only for romance but for freedom. A church hymn wasn't just worship, it was a coded promise that deliverance would come, if not today, then tomorrow. Meanwhile, television was reshaping how Americans saw themselves. Shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best painted a picture of white middle-class perfection. Rarely, if ever, did those screens reflect the lives of Black families who worked just as hard, dreamed just as big, and loved just as deeply. Instead, they lived in a reality hidden in plain sight. Their contributions to the culture heard, but their faces kept off the screen. The gap between image and truth widened, and the music became the bridge. Picture a Friday night in 1957. A Black teenager in Memphis sneaks out to meet friends at a local dance hall. The DJ drops Little Richard's Tutti Frutti and the floor explodes. For a moment, segregation disappears on the dance floor, feet moving faster than prejudice can keep up. Yet when the night ends, those teenagers still walk home to a divided world. Music gave them glimpses of freedom, but life reminded them how far they still had to go. This was the essence of the 1950s for Black America. Joy braided with pain, progress shadowed by injustice, dreams alive but deferred. And through it all, the soundtrack carried on, sometimes a lullaby, sometimes a battle cry. It told the story of a people who refused to be written out of history. The decade was a prelude. Beneath the doo-wop harmonies and the crooner's charm, the first chords of the civil rights movement were beginning to play. The buses of Montgomery, the voices of gospel choirs, the trembling notes of blues musicians, all were tuning America for the revolution to come. The 1950s weren't just about jukebox hits. They were about dignity demanding its song and justice waiting for its chorus. The late 1950s was a crossroads, a moment when the quiet murmur of discontent began to swell into a chorus too powerful to ignore. The music kept playing, but now it carried a sharper edge, a deeper urgency. The same radios that once played romantic ballads now pulsed with songs that hinted at a changing tide. Black voices, once pushed to the margins, were beginning to shape not just the rhythm of American culture, but the rhythm of American justice. Picture a Sunday morning in Birmingham, Alabama. The church is alive with song. Children clap their hands, mothers sway, and fathers hum along. The preacher's sermon rises and falls like a drumbeat, but it's the choir that carries the heart of the people. Gospel wasn't just worship, it was resistance. It taught that even in chains, the soul could sing. Even in the face of laws designed to silence, the spirit could not be quieted. Each hymn was both prayer and protest, a reminder that dignity was non-negotiable. Meanwhile, outside the church walls, the world was shifting. Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision, had declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. On paper, it looked like progress. But in reality, Black children still faced angry mobs when they tried to walk into classrooms that had been reserved for white students. In 1957, the world watched as 9 brave Black teenagers, the Little Rock Nine, attempted to enter Central High School in Arkansas. They were met with spit, curses, and soldiers blocking their path. And yet, they kept walking. Their courage became another note in the rising anthem of justice. Music mirrored this courage. Listen closely to the doo-wop groups harmonizing on street corners. Beneath the sweetness of their melodies was a defiant joy, young men and women, creating beauty in neighborhoods America had neglected. Their songs spoke of love and heartbreak, but they also carried the pride of existing, of being seen, of demanding space in a world that tried to erase them. Each note said, "We are here and we are not going anywhere." For many white Americans, the 1950s were an era of comfort. For Black Americans, it was an era of confrontation. Every trip to a diner, every attempt to buy a house, every visit to a polling station could be a reminder that the promises of freedom weren't meant to include them. Yet it was precisely in these everyday moments that the seeds of revolution were planted. Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat in 1955 wasn't planned as the start of a movement, but it became a spark that lit the Montgomery bus boycott. And when the boycott succeeded after more than a year of walking, carpooling, and sacrifice, it showed the world that change was possible. The soundtrack followed closely. Mahalia Jackson's soaring gospel voice became a balm for the weary and a rallying cry for the hopeful. Jazz musicians like Miles Davis and John Coltrane bent notes into freedom's language, proving that improvisation itself could be resistance. And rhythm and blues kept seeping into mainstream America, challenging the walls of segregation, not just in schools but on the airwaves. White teenagers were dancing to Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Fats Domino artists whose brilliance could not be contained by the color line. Music was integrating hearts long before laws caught up. Yet dignity often came at a cost. Many black musicians who pioneered rock and roll saw their work repackaged by white performers who reaped the fame and fortune. It was a painful contradiction. The sound of Black America was shaping the entire culture, but Black Americans themselves were denied access to the prosperity they created. This exploitation wasn't new, but in the 1950s it became impossible to ignore. The world was dancing to a beat born out of black struggle, and the question lingered: how long would America take the art while denying the artist? Despite this injustice, black families found ways to create joy. Backyard cookouts filled neighborhoods with laughter, children played stickball in the streets, and elders told stories that connected the present to the past. Music wove through it all. A simple radio on a windowsill could turn a sweltering summer evening into a celebration. Even in poverty, dignity shone. Even in discrimination, dreams survived. And slowly, the nation began to hear those dreams. The 1950s closed with a tension that could no longer be ignored. The civil rights movement was no longer on the horizon. It was here, gathering momentum, powered by the very people who had endured the hardest trials of the decade. Black preachers, teachers, musicians, and everyday citizens were preparing to lead America into a new era, one that would demand the country live up to its promise of equality. Think of a record spinning in 1959, maybe it's a Ray Charles hit that mixes gospel fire with popular appeal. Maybe it's Dinah Washington's velvet voice filling a nightclub. Maybe it's Chuck Berry making teenagers believe they could drive their cars faster, live their lives louder, and dream bigger. That record isn't just playing music, it's playing history. It's the sound of a people transforming pain into power, invisibility into influence. It's the sound of America at the edge of a revolution. Looking back now, it's easy to paint the 1950s in black and white: segregation versus freedom, pain versus joy, silence versus song, but the truth is more complex. Life was lived in shades of resilience. Black families carved out dignity in the smallest details. The way a mother pressed her child's school clothes, the way a father saved for his daughter's college education, the way communities gathered to sing, to eat, to pray, to dance. These were not just moments of survival. They were acts of defiance, a refusal to be broken by a system designed to crush the spirit. And the soundtrack was always there, echoing those acts of defiance. Each melody carried more than notes, it carried memory. It carried the laughter of children running through neighborhoods, the cries of mothers mourning lost sons, the prayers of preachers calling down justice, the footsteps of marchers refusing to step aside. So what was life like in 1950s America? For Black Americans, it was a life lived between beauty and brutality, between dreams and denials. It was a decade when the nation tried to move forward while holding on to old chains. But it was also the decade when those chains began to rattle. The world was listening, even if it didn't know it yet. And the music? It was the heartbeat of it all. From gospel choirs to blues clubs, from street corner harmonies to the birth of rock and roll, the soundtrack of the 1950s was more than entertainment. It was testimony. It was a chronicle of injustice and resilience, of sorrow and joy. It was the voice of a people who refused to be silent, who sang their way through oppression and, in doing so, tuned the nation for change. When you think of your grandparents' lives, don't just picture the chrome cars and black and white televisions. Picture the hymns sung in churches where hope refused to die. Picture the vinyl records worn thin from playing the same song over and over, because that song carried something words couldn't express. Picture the courage it took just to walk into a school, to sit on a bus, to vote in an election. Picture the dignity it took to keep singing, even when no one seemed to listen. The 1950s were not just a backdrop to the civil rights movement, they were its overture. The soundtrack of that decade is not frozen in time. It still speaks to us today. It reminds us that change begins with voices refusing to be silenced, that dignity can survive even the harshest injustice, and that music, simple, powerful, unstoppable, can carry a people through the darkest nights into the promise of dawn. So when you hear the old songs, when a doo-wop tune drifts from a diner jukebox, when Ray Charles' voice fills the room, when Mahalia Jackson's gospel sends shivers down your spine, remember, you're not just hearing music, you're hearing history. You're hearing the heartbeat of the 1950s. You're hearing the sound of America learning, painfully and beautifully, what freedom truly means.